In the late evening hours of April 19, 1989, a 10-year-old boy, identified in the record only as Roger S., was asleep in his home in Orlando, Florida. It was around 11:30 p.m. when he woke up, and what he found surrounding his bed would stay with him for the rest of his life. Standing around him were 4 figures. Each one was roughly 5.5 feet tall, and each one was staring directly at him. Their heads were heart-shaped, and where eyes should have been were 2 enormous black voids. Their faces had 2 small holes where a nose would sit and a thin slit of a mouth, gold in colour. There were no other features to speak of. No ears, no hair, nothing that softened the appearance of these things standing silently at the edges of his bed. Roger had no time to process what he was seeing before he found himself lifted from his mattress, apparently without any physical effort on the part of the figures, and placed onto what he could only describe as a table-like device with no legs, constructed from something that felt like glass beneath him. The table began to move. It floated upward and drifted toward his bedroom window, which opened on its own as he approached it. Roger was carried through it and out into the night air, moving across the darkness toward a field nearby where a strange object hovered silently above the ground. He described it as looking like 2 plates, one flipped upside down over the other, a classic disc shape, sitting motionless in the field as if it had been waiting for him. As he and the floating table drew closer to the craft, a door opened on its side, and then everything went dark. When Roger became aware of his surroundings again, he was standing inside a room. Beside him was another table, this one black. The 4 figures were still with him. As he looked around trying to make sense of where he was, something strange began to happen. The creatures were communicating with him, but not out loud. The words, or something functioning like words, were arriving directly inside his head, bypassing his ears entirely. One of the entities reached forward and pressed a button on the black table. Immediately, a light beneath it illuminated the entire floor of the room. Roger then noticed a large screen hanging in the space above him. On its underside were several panels, which one of the creatures was closely examining, running what appeared to be checks or observations. Moments later, an image appeared on the screen. It was the craft he was currently aboard, seen from the outside. Then, right before his eyes, the craft on the screen shot straight upward at tremendous speed, disappearing into the sky in an instant. The telepathic voice asked him what he was. Roger replied that he was a human boy. He was then led into another room on the ship, where he was shown pictures of a friend of his, a girl he knew as Nancy. When he asked where she was, the creatures told him she was on a different craft. What came next was perhaps the strangest thing communicated to him during the entire experience. He was told that Nancy will not be reborn because she had been born too many times. No further explanation was offered. The implication that these beings had some involvement in determining whether a soul would experience reincarnation, and that there was apparently a limit to how many times that process could repeat, was left hanging without any elaboration. Whether Roger understood the full weight of what he was being told in that moment is unclear, but the detail itself is remarkable, and it didn't disappear from his recollection. Shortly after, as images from both the past and the future played across the large screen, a small device floated toward Roger's hands. The creatures explained that it had taken a sample of skin from a wound on one of his fingers. He was then guided further through the ship and along the way he passed a man seated on a table similar to the one he had been transported on earlier. Roger estimated the man was around 30 years old. He appeared to simply be sitting there, and Roger had no opportunity to speak to him or understand why he was aboard before he was moved along. The creatures then brought him to another panel and told him he could press any of the buttons he wished. As he did so, he noticed that the smaller craft he was aboard appeared to be docking with or entering a much larger ship. The vessel around him was becoming part of something far bigger. The creatures then instructed him to remove his pyjamas and handed him a red suit. When he put it on, it clung tightly to his body, form-fitting in a way that felt unlike any fabric he had encountered. Looking the garment over, Roger noticed that it was covered in symbols he could only describe as resembling hieroglyphics, markings that looked ancient, structured and deliberate, whatever their actual meaning. While walking to yet another room, Roger noticed something mounted on the wall, a map. He recognised it immediately as a map of America. The next room was unlike any of the others. It was square, and along its walls were rows of screens and buttons that the creatures moved to immediately and began working at with focused attention. But what caught Roger's attention above everything else in that room was a single screen in the corner showing something deeply unsettling: his own bedroom back in Orlando. He could see himself lying asleep in his bed, exactly as he had been before any of this began. And then, as he watched the screen, he saw his father walk into the room to check on him. His father looked at him, at the sleeping version of him, and then left. Roger was watching his own body from somewhere far away, apparently still present in his room as far as his father was concerned. He had been in two places at once, or perhaps he had never physically left at all. Before he could begin to work through what that meant, he was taken into another room, this one round. In the centre was a glass box, large enough for a person to stand inside. The creatures told him to step into it, and he did. They closed the door behind him and moved to the buttons on the wall. A red laser-like device began moving slowly above him, passing back and forth. He was told that it was taking a brain scan. From there, he was led into another room where he encountered 3 more beings. These ones were similar in basic shape to the others, but noticeably different in appearance. Their skin had a distinct orange tone, and while their eyes were the same shape as those of his original abductors, they appeared blurry rather than the sharp, depthless black he had seen before. The voice in his head told him these were the women of their race. They remained in the room with him for a short time, and then they left. Roger was then taken into what was perhaps the most remarkable room he encountered during the entire experience. It was noticeably larger than the others, and along its walls were multiple glass cages. Inside the cages were animals, some that Roger recognised as ordinary creatures from Earth, the kind he might have seen at a zoo or in a field. But others were something else entirely, strange, unnatural combinations of different animals, mixed together in ways that had no equivalent in the natural world. They were alive, contained, and apparently collected. The room had the feel of a repository or a catalogue of living things gathered from somewhere and kept for reasons Roger was not told. Eventually, the return journey began. He was led back to the smaller craft and taken back toward Earth. As he moved through the ship on his way out, he followed a small red sphere that seemed to lead the way, guiding him through the corridors. But on this return passage, he moved through a room that gave him what was arguably the most troubling image of the whole night. Inside, a group of humans were seated at screens, apparently engaged in some kind of active work. They were wearing uniforms. On those uniforms were NASA logos. And in front of them, lying on surfaces positioned before the screens, were several alien beings. The humans appeared to be performing experiments on them. Roger passed through without stopping, following the red sphere, and said nothing about whether any of the humans noticed him. Then he was back in his room in Orlando, alone. The figures were gone. The floating glass table, the red hieroglyphic suit, the brain scan, the glass cages, the screen showing his sleeping body. All of it was behind him, leaving only the memory of what had taken place somewhere between 11:30 p.m. on the 19th of April, 1989, and the moment he found himself standing in his bedroom again. The account of Roger S., sourced through a man named James S. Greenan, first came to public attention via the internet, and it occupies a complicated position in the broader record of abduction testimony. There is no physical evidence. There is no independent witness who can confirm Roger left his home that night. And the detail of his father entering his room while he apparently still lay in his bed raises a serious and genuinely interesting question. Was this a physical abduction, or was it something closer to an out-of-body experience? A state in which the mind or consciousness travels while the body remains exactly where it was. That question has surfaced in other abduction cases, where witnesses have reported seeing the supposed abductee remain motionless and trance-like throughout the duration of the experience. And yet the account is layered with details that reappear consistently across other abduction reports, from cases both before and after 1989. The heart-shaped heads, the entirely black eyes, the communication through thought rather than sound, the structured tour through multiple distinct rooms aboard the craft, the presence of other humans who appear to have been taken as well, and the glass-enclosed animals, none of these were unique to Roger. They show up elsewhere in cases with named witnesses and more traceable sourcing, often described in nearly identical terms by people who had no apparent connection to one another. The remark about Nancy and reincarnation is harder to place, but no less striking for it. The suggestion that beings from outside this world have some role in governing whether a human soul returns, and that there is a ceiling on how many times that return is permitted, is not the kind of detail that fits neatly into any established framework, scientific or otherwise. And yet something about its specificity makes it difficult to simply set aside. The hieroglyphic symbols on the red suit add another layer. The ancient Egyptians were consumed by questions of the afterlife, of judgment, of the soul's passage through realms beyond the physical. Whether the appearance of hieroglyphic-style markings on a garment handed to a 10-year-old boy in 1989 means anything beyond coincidence is impossible to say. But the overlap sits there regardless. And then there is the NASA detail, humans in uniform conducting experiments on alien beings aboard what appeared to be a cooperative or shared facility. It is the kind of claim that invites immediate skepticism, and reasonably so. But it is also not the first time such a detail has appeared in abduction accounts. A human presence, apparently working in some capacity alongside or in relation to non-human entities, surfaces in enough separate reports to make it a recurring element rather than an isolated one. The account of Roger S. from Orlando, Florida, on the night of April 19, 1989, does not resolve into anything clean or comfortable. It raises more questions than it answers, and the sourcing behind it means it demands caution before any firm conclusions are drawn. But it is the kind of account that, once placed alongside others, refuses to quietly disappear. The details are too specific, too consistently echoed in other cases, and strange in precisely the ways that other strange accounts tend to be strange, to be set aside without a second look,